Hello, everybody, and thank you all very much for coming. So I've been told not to reveal any of the plot. I both have to introduce the novel without telling you anything about it. So that's the particular constraint that I'm under tonight. Having already written the introduction to it, so I don't want to just repeat what I said before. So I'll talk a little bit about the book and some of the things I've been thinking about more recently. So it's the fourth of the Palliser or parliamentary novels. His Phineas written in 1867, comes out 1867 to 79, and that, sorry, 69. And that comes out in St. Paul's magazine, which is the one that Trollope himself edit. And then there's the 5-6 year gap before Phineas Redux comes. And somebody just sent me a message saying, "We like your Teletubby." So thank you for that. And the place it comes out is a slightly different one from the St. Paul. So it comes out in a magazine called The Graphic, and that's a weekly magazine and not a monthly. So the kind of model of a monthly literary magazine is something like this, which is the Cornhill. The Cornhill is a kind of monthly, very attractively illustrated. And that's the kind of model that Gray had established and that Trollope and many others kind of imitate. The Graphic is not like that. Graphic is revolutionary in many ways. So in the 1842, Illustrated London News comes out. So the page is much bigger. It's very news kind of driven. It comes out weekly and it's full of engravings. Engravings aren't high quality as they might have been. And so then the Graphic in the late 1860s and early 1870s revolutionized it with the same format, weekly, very visual, with higher quality illustration. So it's an interesting place for Trollope's fiction to appear, in which the visual appearance matters more. And the artists who work for it are also different too. They're kind of social realists in a way. And the guy who is Trollope's illustrator is Frank Hull. Hull's quite a well-known artist at the time. With Phineas Finn, it's illustrated by John Everett Millais, who's Trollope's favourite illustrator, and he's much less keen on the pictures for Phineas Redux. So the whole physical appearance of it is different. He says in the autobiography it's one novel, to form one novel, and it comes out in 26 weekly parts, not the 20 monthly ones, but it would be a more common pattern. Now, the news context, I think, matters quite a lot. There's sometimes a division between what you can call realistic fiction in the period and sensation fiction, like Wilkie Collins. Trollope doesn't really believe in that distinction. But you see the way that there is quite a newsy context to this book as you read it. So there's a lot about the press in it. Very interested in the power of the press. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's interested in scandalous things like bigamy and murder. Interested in trial. So all these things that are highly newsworthy public events, they all are both part of the context in which it appears, but also part of the book itself. Okay, so there's a strong kind of news. There's been a strong kind of news context for the book. There's an election in it. There's a trial. There's bigamy and murder. There's much about the power of the press. It's interested in current and topical events. In the same way that with Phineas Finn, there's a kind of shadowing of real political events. There isn't a kind of direct description of it in the book. Written a bit earlier than when it comes out, and when he's actually approached by the editor of the Graphic for a novel, because will you write a novel in the future? Trollope says, "Oh, fine. I already have one in the box, as it were. He's in Australia and New Zealand at the time. And also in the box is a very short, interesting novel called An Eye for an Eye, and that's the kind of pair he puts in the box together when he goes to Australia and New Zealand, and that's a much more melodramatic story than Phineas Redux. So in a way, it's a moment of kind of peak Trollope, this, because astonishingly, between Phineas Finn and Phineas Redux, although he thinks of it as one novel, he writes many more. And I've made a list of them because I can't remember them all. But between the two, he writes, he knew he was right, Vicar of Bullhampton, Linda Tressel, Golden Lyle of Granpere, Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite, Ralph the Heir, the Eustace Diamond, as well, of course, as the commentaries on Caesar. And by the time it's coming out, he's starting The Way We Live Now. So you see, he's both extremely productive and also writing some very important novels. Eustace Diamond, Where We Live Now, knew he was right. Gets paid £2,500 for it. So that's not quite as much as for Phineas Finn, where he gets 3,200. But probably in today's prices, it would be about £300,000. So pretty good going, I mean, for 6 months' work. And the other great thing that happens kind of between the two books is that he stands for Parliament. So he stands for Beverley in East Yorkshire, which is not very far from where I am in York. And it's a small market town just outside Hull. And he has the most horrible time. He comes bottom in the poll. He's miserable when he's there. At this point, we don't have the secret ballot. Trollope doesn't believe in the secret ballot. There's a lot of bribery, as there is in the election in Phineas Redux. And he comes kind of thoroughly disillusioned with what happened in his dream. And that kind of darkness, in a way, I think, colours Phineas Redux. He doesn't have a nice time, and Phineas doesn't have a nice time when he stands at Tankerville early on in Phineas Redux. Reviews of it are pretty good on the whole. There's certain things they like. They like Lord Chiltern a lot. They like the winning characters, as so often, rightly, I think. Most interesting of the contemporary reviews is by Mathilde Blind, or Blind, who's a German exile, and she's at this point a poet and reviewing a good deal. She brother attempts to assassinate Bismarck, and so her parents then flee Germany. And so in the exile circle that he's moving in, he meets Mazzini, Louis Blanc, the French socialist, and Karl Marx. So it's an interesting world that she's coming out of, and she sees it as just rather stuffy and bourgeois and English and provincial. So that rather complacent in a way. But on the whole, the reviews are pretty positive. You know what the kind of thing Trollope gives you, and those who like it, like it. But Flynn is someone just coming from a slightly different universe of thought and of politics, and is much more skeptical about it. So the politics of the book are very important. People disagree about how interested Trollope is, really, politics, whether he's interested in political process or strategy. I think in some ways is a question. Whether he seems to me that in a way he's more into the kind of preliminaries for politics, the kind of building of alliances, the electioneering, the personal friendship. Those are often the things rather than policy or strategy. And it's often, I think, the other thing I think about the way that thinks about politics is through the idea of friendship. So that in a way, it's often been said that the whole basis of political thought is the friend-enemy distinction. And that's there both on a kind of local level, who are your friends and enemies in Parliament, but also between states as well. And the word friend just keeps coming back and back in the, I think it's 400 odd times it appears. And he's very interested in those relationships more than in family relationships. So that Phineas has two sisters who appear at an important point in the book, but they're not even named. And part of the interest or the strangeness, I think, of Phineas at the beginning is the kind of question about what kind of mourning or otherwise be in. So, you know, at the end of Phineas Finn, he goes back to Ireland with marries Mary Flood Jones, becomes inspector of poorhouses in Cork. So Mary dies in childbirth, and then he comes back to London at the beginning of Phineas Redux. And one question is, has that changed him at all? I mean, we learn almost nothing, I think, about what work he was doing was with the poorhouses. They're obviously massive, controversial institution in the 19th century, often hated by the poor, and dominated by Dickens and Carlyle and many others. That doesn't seem to feed into Trollope's conception of what Phineas is like, or indeed being a widower who's lost a child. So it tends to be friendship, I think. It's one of the key elements of the book, and what limits of friendship are, and what the nature of that friendship is, whether friendship can turn to romance or otherwise. The other thing you'll notice, I think, is like friend keeps recurring as a word, and that's characteristic of the kind of sticky phrasing you get in the book, where words and phrases just keep repeating. I used to think it was kind of laziness on Trollope's part that the same words would recur. I think he's interested in the way that people come to believe in things simply by saying the same thing again. So Phineas's name gets mentioned a lot, and he gets kind of invited over to re-enter Parliament, where he's abandoned. So there's a close binding together of questions of politics and friendship, and also between the social world, the world of journalism, and the world of politics. Phineas is at the centre of it, and people feel differently about him, I think. He's clearly meant to be very handsome and charming and charismatic. How much we're told that and how much we're shown that is a question, I think. And how different he is from the first half of Phineas Finn is a question I think that you'll probably want to talk about. I mean, he looks different in the pictures, but that may be just because it's Frank Hall rather than Mealy. He looks older and sadder. But one question I think about Phineas, and indeed about the book, is how much is this a repetition? Is he going back to the place he began, or is he coming back to a very different kind of world? One way, he seems to be coming back to the same thing, the same three major women that he has relationships with, the same party, most of the people we've seen before in politics are still in politics. In some ways, it's rather similar. Is it also important in subtle or deeper kinds of ways? And the three women are, of course, Laura Kennedy now, Violet Effingham, comes Violet Chilton, and Madame Max Whistler. And in some ways, they're the heart of the book, I think. And so often in Trollope, these women characters are particularly interesting. And of course, the fourth would be Glencora, who, I don't know if I'm following the plot, becomes the Duchess of Omnium in the book. She's another one else who changes. And these three women are all in different states, as it were. One is married, happily, Violet. One is single, Madame Mac, and the third is separated, and that Lady Laura, Trollope thinks of as the most interesting character of the book, and I think the emotion she carries quite a lot of the weight of it, and indeed the suffering of the book. And so the situation at the beginning, and stop me if this seemed uncannily familiar, is a kind of rundown conservative government clinging desperately for office. And the Prime Minister is Bowen, who's the kind of Israeli figure, and Tolop, of course, is very hostile to Israeli, and Bowen is determined to cling on to power, and he does so through proposing what's essentially a liberal or Whig measure, i.e. the disestablishment of the Church of England. So the Whigs or the Liberals, or part of it at least, this had been a key issue for them in the 19th century. It still hasn't happened, except in Wales, which it did in 1910, but it's still an established church. And it is, of course, shocking for the Conservative Party that a Conservative Prime Minister would make this a policy suggestion, stability. And it's also very annoying for the Whigs, who feel they've had their clothes, Liberals, the Whigs or Liberals who had their clothes stolen, as it were. They then have to oppose a measure that, in fact, they probably support. But that's the kind of political situation at the beginning. It's a nicely kind of complex mixed in between, typically kind of Fallopian complexity, in which personality here, particularly Bowen, comes to matter deal. And it's also, I mean, it doesn't happen in true life, although the Conservatives had passed the Second Reform Act in 1867, and several key measures of reform, bizarrely, interestingly, had come through Conservative administration, like Catholic emancipation earlier in the century and the repeal of the Corn Laws. So what you think of as reforming Whig or Liberal measures, in fact, end up being passed by Conservative administrations. So it's not completely implausible that this would be the kind of move or maneuver or trick that audacious kind of cynicism that a Disraeli or a Daubeny might carry on. But on the political context, I'm sure you know Nick Shrimpton's really useful piece at the end of the Oxford World Classics edition that lays out the differences and the parallels and the time frames between the, quote, real politics and the fictional politics of this book. So I feel slightly constrained that I don't spoil an awful thing by telling you what happened. But here are a few little pointers. Okay. But first of all, I think of it's a novel that's very interested in the press, and interestingly interested in the press. So the figure of Quintus Slide, who I think you probably know, has now kind of changed allegiance. And so he's exceptionally interesting, I think, because he's a populist conservative, a radical who's become a conservative, but in a populist idiom, who's highly moralizing and deeply immoral. So it's a certain kind of journalism that I think is the Tolop is prescient about, because it becomes very important in the 20th century, and I think even today, that again, I don't want to spoil the story, but the curious intermixture of political life, public life, and moral reputation, with a strong political right-wing inflection that Tolop works on in this book, and that I think has all sorts of interesting resonances. It's a book, I said in the introduction that I thought kind of media novel, or a novel about mediation, i.e. it's about people and things in in-between states. So the novel begins with kind of weird in-between state in which government is kind of in power but not quite in power. And Tolop is between Ireland and England, and it's also interested in the media and the sense of newspapers. So one way of thinking about that is a novel about mediation, media. It's also a novel about hunting, and hunting I think is really interesting. You know, Tolop notoriously loved hunting. Complains about the Beverley by-election, for example, that one day he got one day off to go hunting. That was catastrophic. Either he was bidden to do it by his agent, or he did it and it's seen as scandal, a waste time. But hunting matters to the book. One of the things the reviewers pick out is the depiction of the master of foxhound, Lord Chiltern, who, after kind of rather dangerous figure he is in Phineas Finn, finds fulfillment in this slightly monomaniacal pursuit of foxes across the English countryside. But there's lots of comic themes there, and he also likes the kind of freedom that it gives to women to be active and sociable and to have chance encounters and to show physical courage and so forth. So there's some very interesting and some very funny fox hunting scenes and material. It's useful in plot terms too. Pursuit. Wildness, so that Lord Chiltern is less wild, but the sense that men are quite vulnerable to all sorts of obsession. I mean, there's a kind of mild version of it with Plantagenet Palliser and his love of decimal currency or obsessive interest in decimal currency. But there are also much, much darker versions of it in this novel, where, and I presume this is something to do with Trollope's father and being stuck with his father when his mother goes off to America, but there's a kind of worry or vulnerability in the male mind to obsession and incipient madness, really. And that's a kind of thread that runs through the book. Women, by contrast, seem much more sane, sober, and strategic, and sensible. I think that's the case. And, you wouldn't. It's the women friends you can rely on to get you through difficulties, I think. So the male mind is kind of vulnerable. It's full of good letters. It's like so many Trollope novels. He loves letters. The post office, of course, and there's some very good ones that it's often a highlight in his novels. It's a book about the law, and there's a trial. I won't tell you more than that. That's of some importance, and that the nature of legal jeopardy is very interestingly explored, I think, by Trollope, and he's interested, as Dickens was, in the psychological processes that what does it mean to be that place. I think the women are exceptionally well done. I think Madame Max is so. And also, I think the other thing I'd just point to, I think, to finish, is the very nice way that he manages to plug together material from the Eustace Diamond into Phineas Finn, and the two come together as it were in the later stages of Phineas Redux. Did I manage that? Did I manage to talk about the book without spoiling it?